this is going to be a lengthy and lingering war, which translates into the fact that the threat of further aggression from Russia remains. So here's the question for the British government. How, in land warfare terms, are we going to respond to that? Should we continue with cutting the size of the army, which we're currently doing, having a very modest spend on just modernizing 148 Challenger tanks into Challenger 3, scrapping the Warrior armored infantry fighting vehicles and replacing them purely with a wheeled vehicle, which will give us a pretty thin land capability? Or should we actually be saying, no, this Ukraine war is a wake-up in land warfare terms. We need to be increasing our overall spend on defence and increase our investment into land forces to make sure that we, the UK, as a strong NATO partner, can take part in a series of strong deterrent deployments in the Baltics, in Poland, Estonia, elsewhere, to make sure that we do face down any future threats of aggression from Russia. That's where we are today, and that's what the Ukrainian war is telling us.
Hello and welcome, and today I'm talking the British Army with General Lord Dannatt, former Chief of the General Staff, which is the head of the army, and Robert Lyman, historian and friend of the show, and they are both authors of Victory to Defeat. At the end of the First World War, the British Army was a highly effective fighting force that had defeated the Germans with victories right up there with those of the 18th and 19th centuries. Just over 20 years later, the army was humiliated in Belgium and France and was forced into a costly retreat that was so close to an unmitigated disaster. So how did we get there? And what are the lessons today for the British Army as we see an increasingly threatening Russia? Before we start, just a few basics for you. This was recorded before the recent attacks in Israel. Also, a few military basics. A battalion is about 1,000, commanded by a lieutenant colonel. A brigade is approximately 5,000 with a brigadier at the top. And a division is 14,000 roughly, with a major general in charge. Now that's the limit of army knowledge you'll need, and I know that because I just had to look it up. Coming up next week, I have a couple of bonus episodes. First is the Film Club, which is on the new Scorsese movie Killers of the Flower Moon, and that includes an interview with Chief Standing Bear. I also have a bonus on the history of running. Please do rate and review and tell your friends if you can. I'd be hugely grateful. Until then, listen to myself, the General, and Rob discussing the British Army. Richard Dannatt, Robert Lyman, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. It's a great pleasure to have you on.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Ollie.
And likewise, Ollie. It's good to be back on.
Yes, Robert, been a frequent guest on the podcast. But today we're here to talk about the book that you've both written together, Victory to Defeat, the British Army 1918 to 1940. And it's such a treat to have you both to speak about the book. And Richard or Lord Dannatt, General, what would you rather I address you as? General it seems to make sense.
I think General would do as far as this context is concerned. Yeah.
Splendid. Well, I was very interested as to why you both decided to write the book, because we are in the midst of a change, I think, in the way maybe since February 22, and the way the current British Army looks at threats in the world. And I can't help but think about Ukraine whilst reading the book. But what I really wanted to know was why you did want to write the book.
Well, if I can launch in there, first of all, if we cast our minds back, I suppose, almost the last 10 years, there's been a sort of growing concern about resurgent Russia. And that's prompted thoughts about the parallels between what's been going on in the last 5-10 years and what was going on in the 1930s. In the 1930s, we saw a dictator, Hitler, who came to power in 1933. We chose not to confront him. We chose to appease him. Appeasement failed, and then very late in the day, we rearmed. As the book shows, too late in the day to save the British Expeditionary Force in France, which was effectively defeated on the battlefield and had to withdraw via Dunkirk. And so contrast that experience with what's been going on in the last 5-10 years, particularly since Putin annexed Crimea in 2014 and moved into Luhansk and Donetsk provinces. And so it was going through my mind that there was a book that could be written focusing on the parallels between now and the parallels in the interwar years.
And you're right, Ollie, about your observation about Ukraine. I mean, it's been a presence with us throughout the entirety of the writing process, and it's very hard not to draw parallels with Ukraine. In that sense, it's a very opportune book. It's as we were writing it, we were conscious that we were actually writing what could be described as a cautionary tale for the British Army. This is what happens when you lose sight of what an army exists for. You made the point before, I think we started recording, about the need for the government to be very clear about the purpose of an army, its strategic purpose, its grand strategic purpose. And I think we concluded very clearly during the interwar years that the British government lost sight of this, or in fact, it probably got the ultimate purpose, strategic purpose of the army wrong. It believed it was for imperial defense without recognizing actually that after the chaos of the First World War, the inevitable consequence of that political chaos that ensued would be another difficulty in Europe, which required an army that was able to fight at a high intensity over a sustained period of time. So, I mean, a number of things did come together quite remarkably for us as we were writing. And if we're honest, one of our concerns was the timeliness of the book, because with an end of the fighting in Ukraine, perhaps, then we had, I think, less to say. That's been proven to be a wrong assumption. There is an enormous amount of longevity in the principles in which we have identified in the interwar years. Whether or not Ukraine existed, the governments need to take the role of the army and its effectiveness incredibly serious, perhaps much more seriously than they have.
I think one of the arguments that we tried to make is that had the British government in the 1930s understood better the utility of a force in being, of actually having an army, and if it had been, let's say, 4 to 6 divisions, but well organized, well found, like the expeditionary force that deployed in 1914, then when Hitler was starting to push into the Rhineland, push towards Czechoslovakia, it would have been quite possible for the British government to have decided to deploy that expeditionary force to France to stand alongside the French, and actually just said to Hitler, no, this far and no more. And it's conceivable that had that happened, it would have deterred what became the Second World War. And as Rob has been writing in the Jewish Chronicle quite recently, that would actually have had the hugely beneficial consequence that the Holocaust might never have happened. So there are a tremendous number of consequences from the failure to realize that a force in being doesn't have to be huge, but it has to be capable. It can then be credible and act as a significant deterrent in the way that manifestly didn't happen in the 1930s. And frankly, we're concerned it's not actually happening in the 2020s.
Exactly. I mean, one of the challenges that I've had over the last couple of days in discussing this, Richard, I haven't actually told you this, but I was talking to a very close friend, a person I've known for many, many years, and he said, aren't you just involved in special pleading for the army for sentimental reasons? The reality is that Britain's strategic security has always been provided by the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. And this is an educated person who frankly should have known better, because the reality is, as we explain in the book, the defense and security of this country is not a zero-sum game. That is, that what you offer the RAF and the Royal Navy, if that's the way you're going to apportion services, and you provide money for a strategic deterrent, doesn't mean that you stop thinking about the army as an integral part of that purpose. And I was forced to remind this individual that we had a continental commitment as a country. So the big argument for all the century after 1815 was the extent to which Britain got itself involved strategically or in a security perspective on the continent. We've had a strategic involvement on the continent since at least 1939, and in a structural and a strategic way since the establishment of the Western European Union and then NATO. So NATO is incredibly important to us, and the army is an incredibly important constituent to that set of relationships that create the security infrastructure of the United Kingdom. It's not zero-sum. It's not, well, we've got a nuclear deterrent. One of the challenges in the 1930s was that a very large swathe of political opinion believed that the Royal Air Force would be able to deter any adventurism from a country like France, indeed, or as indeed was the case in one paper in the 1930s, or indeed Germany as the decade wore on. The truth was that it wasn't good enough and it didn't work. and the government needed to think more strategically about how it created the army to respond to a set of very, very evident threats.
And during the 1920s and 30s, you had a military leadership that had, well, as you illustrate in the book, the final years of the First World War, and particularly 1918, were victories to rank up with any other victories that the British Army had achieved over the years. So you had military leaders who'd got these wins under the belt, as it were. Where was the failure? Was it in their persuading the political leadership that the army was where they needed to prioritize, or at least, and equipment as well needs to be prioritized? Was it failure in persuading political leadership, or was it a lack of political imagination, a bit of both? Where was the failure?
We'll both have a go at that, because there are a multitude of strands that actually form the substance of the argument in the book. If we start perhaps from the premise that you've just referred to, by and large, the same group of generals that struggled in 1916 and to an extent in 1917 were still there and in charge by 1918, by which time they had worked out through trial and error how to better integrate infantry, armor, artillery, communications, logistics, such that they had a winning doctrine that to be able to defeat during the 100 Days campaign the German army in the field. And that undoubtedly was a success, as you've alluded to. The problem then came with the awful feeling at the end of the First World War that this had to be the war to end wars. It had been so ghastly. We had lost a better part of 1 million people. Most families in the United Kingdom had had their lives shattered in some shape or form. So we needed to make sure that this was the war to end wars. This translated into a government policy that there had been no major commitment of an expeditionary force, certainly into Europe, for 10 years, and that rolled on year into the 1930s. And of course, that then led to a vast reduction in the size of the army. There was also the realization, or the getting back to the previous pre-war purposes of the army, which, as we were saying earlier, was by and large to police the empire and to garrison the empire. And this takes you to the structure of the army since the mid-late 19th century, based on the Cardwell reforms, where, for example, infantry battalions typically had 2 regular battalions and a regimental depot somewhere. One battalion, the up-to-strength battalion, was deployed somewhere in India, Egypt, somewhere in the empire, doing the policing role. The battalion at home was largely in a recruiting and training mode. So it actually meant that the army at home, it was institutionally very difficult to group it into war-fighting formations that could then be deployed as an expeditionary force. So there's that sort of structural side of it. So put all those things together, it was the war to end wars. There was a 10-year rolling policy that there would not be a major commitment. And there was no structural way that the army could organize itself to be a deployable fighting force. You then throw in, and then I'll turn over to Rob in a moment, you then throw into some sort of macroeconomic sets of circumstances, such as the general strike in the 1920s, the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression. There were significant financial problems that the government was experiencing. But it could fall back on the 10-year rule and say, well, if we're not planning to send a military force anywhere for 10 years, we don't really need to invest in our armed forces particularly. And if you look at the historic spend during the 1920s and 1930s, it was 2 or 3% of GDP, pretty much where it is actually now. And we can come back to that in a moment.
Yes, I mean, it's I think the book is really an explanation of all those multifarious things, as Richard has described, that came together to create a lack of political will in the country to actually ensure that the army was fit for a new war or another war of a high intensity in Europe, for all the reasons that Richard's explained. I think there are a couple of other things that I would also stress, and we make the point in the book. You use the interesting word lack of imagination, and I think I would agree with you. In order to be able to imagine the nature of the threat that you face, you have to actually do some imagining. Well, in terms of understanding the threat, you have to imagine it. You have to identify where the threats might come from. Then you need to determine a way in which you can counter those threats if they ever materialize. And then you need to build up the force structures accordingly. That's a combination of military strategy responding to grand strategy. You make that point very clearly in the book, although we don't I think, actually use the word grand strategy, but that's what it is. It's about the country determining what the challenge is. And you need some imagination. You need political imagination, and you need political capital to be sacrificed to achieve those ends. And I'm afraid for many people throughout the roles of political responsibility in the 1920s and 30s, that just didn't exist. Now, you might argue that people like Churchill in the 1920s, when he was Chancellor and he instituted the 10-year rule, or he allowed it to develop, was simply being politicians and being cautious with the country's purse strings, and that's true as well. But you can't at the same time throw out the reality that we were living in a much more unstable world after 1921, 1922, and every year demonstrated more and more evidence of that. I would say something else as well, which is we don't let the army off the hook in the book. We, in order to be able to prod politicians and give them the ammunition for making the decisions that they needed to make and failed to do, you need an army that is coherent in its view as to what it requires. And this is where Richard describes, after 1919, in the rapid demobilization of the army, we lost all sense of the need to evaluate 1918 in particular. The first evaluation of the lessons learned of the First World War didn't actually take place till 1932. And even then it focused on 1916, not on 1918. So all those fabulous lessons that Richard described in terms of the British Army being able to defeat the Germans in the field were not even investigated. So in 1919 to 21 and 22, we didn't have an army that actually knew why it had won, knew how it had won, and recognized that it was important to keep these lessons close and develop them. And to our cost, it was the Germans who worked very hard with a much pared down army under the Reichswehr in the 1920s that actually did focus hard on learning the lessons of 1918 at our expense. So the army needed to be playing a much more small p political game and going to the politicians, the government of the day, with a clear voice about what it believed was important for the strategic defense of the United Kingdom. I would just, going back to my first observation about the conversation that I had over the weekend with an individual, believing that the army is not a strategic instrument for British politicians. That completely denies the reality of Clausewitz, that actually, however you use your military force, it is an instrument of politics. And if you decide not to ensure that your army is fit to fight a real enemy in Europe, you're cutting off an arm. You're losing the capability that you need to be able to use that force in a political or a military dimension if you need it.
But isn't the challenge always going to be that we live in a democracy? Politicians are always going to struggle with a strategic vision, particularly for the army. Often they don't have military experience. And you're fighting fires with 1 or 2 years of political challenges. And you see that today. Particularly today, you see secretaries of state in ministries lasting a year, 2 years. You mentioned Germany was able to stride forward, particularly in the 30s. They didn't have to worry about democracy too much. Is that going to be a problem that Western democracies will always have?
I think it's very much a problem. And we do reflect this in the book. On the one hand, you have got a country like the United Kingdom determined that the First World War was the war to end wars, the 10-year rule, and no consensus at all that there was an understanding that we might have to get engaged again in Europe. And in fact, any politician in the late 20s, early 30s who suggested that we might have to get involved again in Europe, that was an absolute vote loser. And there were a couple of prominent by-elections that actually showed how that was indeed the case. So we do come back to this point that in the rapid demobilization, 1918, 1990, the army forgot how and why it had won. As Robert has already said, the lessons learned document wasn't published until 1932. There was this very much feeling of getting back to proper soldiering, normal soldiering, getting out there into the empire. Bear in mind, we had to pick up the detritus of the end of the Ottoman Empire. We picked up responsibility for the mandate in Palestine. And oh my goodness, the Irish question suddenly came off the back burner onto the front burner. And we had to deploy 50,000 troops in the early 20s to Ireland. So there were lots of distractions. And even if there were some, like Little Hart and JFC Fuller, who were thinking more doctrinal thoughts. The hierarchy of the army wasn't thinking those doctrinal thoughts. And indeed, doctrine, which could have been the engine to thinking about the future, had no natural home. It had no home in the War Office. It had no home in army headquarters. It had no army. It had no home in the Staff College, for example. So there was no home for doctrine. There was no place for thought. There was no work going into understanding how we'd been so successful in the First World War. So we were consumed, as you're suggesting, with the here and now of the empire, the here and now of Palestine, the here and now of Ireland. Contrast that with Germany, that suffered in the 20s during the Weimar Republic, which gave the grounds for Hitler to seize control and become Chancellor in 1933. And at that point, he put his hands on the levers of decision making and said, right, we are going to tear up the Versailles Agreement, the Reichswehr, which was only £100,000. Forget that, 100,000 men. Forget that. We're going to expand. The Reichswehr, very sensibly, had a very disproportionate high number of officers, so that when it chose to expand, it could expand pretty quickly. So you have a dictatorship barreling towards making the military instrument successful, and you had a liberal democracy which was just going along business as normal, hoping that things would turn out for the best, appeasing a rising dictator, and then, oh my goodness, very late in the day, we've got to do differently. So we had two systems absolutely clashing. And of course, then you must chuck the French into the discussion. The French big takeaway from the First World War was that if you have really effective defensive arrangements, then you can prevent your country being attacked again. Consequently, their effort went into the Maginot Line, fortifications, fixed fortifications, machine guns, artillery, and they even extended that later into the 30s. So we've got three countries going in very different directions. The French putting their faith in concrete and machine guns, the Germans preparing a maneuver force, and us just hoping that all would be well. And you just have to look at the figures behind realizing that all was not well. I mentioned before that the proportion of GDP that we spent on defense in 1935 was 3%. When the nasty stuff really hit the fan in 1939, it shot up to 18%. And by 1940, 46% of our national expenditure was on defense. Now, we very, very nearly got beaten totally in 1940. The army was beaten in France. Fortunately, the investment in fighters in the Royal Air Force just managed to squeak us through and win the Battle of Britain and buy us some time, as we then describe as the book flows into its later chapters.
And so during the 1920s and 30s, with your CGS hat on, had you been chief of the Imperial General Staff in the 30s, have you daydreamed about how you would have dealt with some of the political personalities? Because I was talking to historian Lawrence Friedman, who describes a number of conflicts post-war, and it was interesting. A theme that came out of that was that political and military leadership, often the relationship between the two comes down to personalities. And I wondered whether we were unlucky in that the personalities didn't really gel. I mean, even to the extent that a Secretary of State for War sacks his CGS with a letter on his desk. Did you daydream to think you could have negotiated this a little bit better?
Well, a friend who read the early draft of the book warned me, as a former Chief of the General Staff myself, not to be too critical of the incumbents of that office in the 20s and 30s. And I think that was a very fair warning, which I very much took on board. And you are right that a lot of the success of when ground strategy becoming military strategy is coherent is when the politicians and the admirals, generals, and air marshals are all pretty much marching in step. In my own experience, in sort of period 2005, 2009, when I was Commander-in-Chief Land Command and then Chief of the General Staff, we were conducting two major operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. We were actually organized, equipped, and resourced to do one of those, but being Wilco people, we did two. It was extremely difficult to argue the case for the sufficient number of resources that we needed to be able to effectively deliver both operations. Against the background of the army being at war, but the nation wasn't at war. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force were determined to protect their major equipment spending programs, irrespective of the fact that the army was doing the heavy lifting, the fighting and the dying. So I sort of make that point because sometimes circumstances place a Navy chief, an Army chief, an Air Force chief in circumstances where trying to do what the government actually wants, it's very hard to persuade them to actually give you the stuff to do what it wants. So I think my predecessors in the 20s and 30s, to an extent, knew that they had a responsibility to make sure the army was capable of doing the tasks that it was required to carry out. But there you come to the grand strategy bit, which we've talked about quite a lot. What was the understanding of those tasks? It was to keep the lid on Ireland, to police the empire, have some troops on the streets during the general strike, and as far as the army at home was concerned, make sure it recruited and trained reinforcements to go overseas. The structure wasn't there to create an army that could be used as a strategic weapon in a deterrent way. And of course, that's where we are again today. If we now assume that the Ukrainian war is not going to be over quickly, and we have to accept that the Ukrainian counteroffensive of this summer, with nearly through the summer into the autumn, bad weather's going to come, is probably not going to achieve a major breakthrough. This is going to be a lengthy and lingering war, which translates into the fact that the threat of further aggression from Russia remains. So here's the question for the British government: how, in land warfare terms, are we going to respond to that? Should we continue with cutting the size of the army, which we're currently doing, having a very modest spend on just modernizing 148 Challenger tanks into Challenger 3, scrapping the Warrior armored infantry fighting vehicles and replacing them purely with a wheeled vehicle, which will give us a pretty thin land capability? Or should we actually be saying, no, this Ukraine war is a wake-up in land warfare terms. We need to be increasing our overall spend on defence and increase our investment into land forces to make sure that we, the UK, as a strong NATO partner, can take part in a series of strong deterrent deployments in the Baltics, in Poland, Estonia, elsewhere, to make sure that we do face down any future threats of aggression from Russia. That's where we are today, and that's what the Ukrainian war is telling us.
I think the army's committing to reducing to 72,500. And I don't want to linger too much on today, but one other question. I think the army's committed to 72,500 by 2025.
It's been ordered to go to that number. The current Chief of the General Staff is making the very best of a golf bag with very few meaningful clubs in it. Now, the army today is putting its best possible spin on that it could do for the sake of its own interests and the sake of the morale of soldiers. But if you pick up last month's edition of Soldier magazine, there's a comment that comes in several times: we are being asked all the time to do more with less. Now, that is not a great place to be in when you're going down from 80-something to 70-something.
Yes, well, I remember my father snorting in the 90s that you could fit the army into Wembley Stadium. You can easily fit the army into Wembley Stadium now. But is the ultimate goal, if the CGS were to have unlimited resources, to have a sort of tank-based army stationed in a sort of BAOR, but stationed in the Baltic states and Poland? If you had all your wishes come true, is that the ultimate goal?
Well, I'll let Rob take over in a moment. Of course, what you are just touching on there is the debate that was held fitfully in the mid-late 20s and early 30s about whether we should have a meaningful armoured component to our army. And we experimented with the Armoured Experimental Force in a few half-hearted exercises on Salisbury Plain, late 20s, early 30s, but we pretty much didn't go down that track. The Germans, however, of course, did. And that's one of the hallmarks when the two armies met in France in May, June 1940. Our army was a mechanized lorry that had gone from this country to dig in France in lorries, and it met an armored spearhead that cracked them on the nose. Now, the whole of the German army wasn't armored. There were horse-drawn trucks and horse-drawn artillery and marching infantry behind the Panzer divisions, which was the armored tip of the iceberg, as it were, or the armored tip of the spear. But you have to then bring it back to today. During the Cold War period from 1945 to 1989, we maintained a significant army, armor-based in Germany, 4 armored divisions typically, with brigades that were well equipped with main battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery. Well, we've let that atrophy from 4 divisions to an aspiration to be able to field 1 division. But the reality today is we probably would be stretched to put more than 1 brigade into the field. But the difference between now and the mid-war into war years is we actually have a very well understood and well articulated warfighting doctrine. And the army is well trained and understands it well. The sadness is today we don't have the resources to actually turn that doctrine and that training into a meaningful capability.
I would simply add, we're not advocating for BOR light. What we're advocating for, actually, the first and most important thing to say, from my perspective, is we're simply sounding a wake-up call to remind people of what happens when you hollow out the army. And where we were in 1940 was an army that wasn't capable of fighting in the same way that it had in 1918. And that's exactly the situation we have today. We have spent many, many decades in the British Army ensuring that we can fight with, as Richard says, the appropriate maneuver doctrine, warfighting doctrine. But you need the integrated equipment and trained troops and all the paraphernalia of an army able to engage at that level. And we simply don't have it at the moment. And we need it, really, in order to be able to fulfill our continental commitments. We have a continental commitment today. We have had since the late 1940s in respect of NATO. And again, we lose sight of the fact as a country that if we are unable to pull our weight in that high-intensity warfighting arena, we lose our voice as a country. And for the whole of the BOR period, British Army of the Rhine, part of the NATO commitment, forward commitment to Germany, we had that voice within NATO. We have long lost that in land terms to Poland and so on. That's not necessarily a problem so far as NATO is concerned, but it is a problem in terms of our ability to pull our weight in Europe. And in 1940, we were able to provide a couple of divisions, none of which had exercised or trained together as a warfighting formation. Those divisions that were deployed to France, both regular and territorial, hadn't actually exercised in many years with tanks, armor, infantry, and air as the Germans had. And this is what, if you lose the capability, if you hollow out your forces, you can't train, you can't exercise, you don't build up that body of knowledge in the army about how things are done. This is a really, really serious business. You'll end up, I'm afraid, with an army that might be able to defend an empire that no longer exists.
And I think going on from that, in 1939, 1940, our strategy was deficient, but our level of operational thinking was also different because we had not learned the proper lessons from 1918. We talk about maneuver warfare. Well, to an extent, we employed the beginnings of maneuver warfare in 1918, but we didn't develop those ideas into a clearly understood doctrine that was taught at the Staff College. With the result that in May, June 1940, we were outmaneuvered by the Germans, who understood the art of maneuver. We did not understand the art of maneuver, and therefore we were a sucker, really, to their plans, which effectively outmaneuvered us. I mean, when they attacked, it was decided the right thing to do was for the First French Army to advance into Belgium. The British Expeditionary Force went alongside. They left the positions they'd been preparing all through the winter and went up to the River Dyle to start to dig in again, and then found, oh my goodness, the Germans have punched through the Ardennes, and now they're getting through us, and now they're getting behind us. We were outmaneuvered. We were outmaneuvered physically on the battlefield, and we were outmaneuvered in thought. I mean, fortunately, Lord Gort, as the commander of the BEF, had the wisdom to realize just in time that things were going really pear-shaped, and ordered the withdrawal back to the Channel ports and managed to get the army away through Dunkirk. But it was very nearly a battle of encirclement and annihilation, which would have taken 300,000 British and French troops off the playing field catastrophically. So my point is that our strategy was deficient, our operational level thinking was deficient, and we only mercifully got away with it through the tactical determination of the poor bloody infantry, as always, doing their bit on the ground.
Commanded by generals who would later go on to be promoted to very high level. I mean, you had, I think you had Alan Brooke, Montgomery on the ground at the time. Was
Montgomery,
Alexander on the ground?
Yes, yeah, divisional commander. So you're absolutely right. Most of those who rose to high rank in the British Army in 1944-45 had served, not all, of course, had served in the second BEF. It was hardly surprising. We threw everything we had at the second BEF.
but there's also an observation that we make in the book, and it follows on from what you've just said. One of the divisional commanders, commanding 3rd Division in the withdrawal to Dunkirk, was Bernard Law Montgomery. Well, we all know he went on to command the 8th Army and eventually won the Second Battle of El Alamein, and eventually was successful through North Africa, Sicily, and up into Italy until he was withdrawn to command the Overlord landings in June 1944. But the point is that the big takeaway that he took from the First World War and then applied at Second El Alamein was making sure that he got himself thoroughly well organized, got the forces that he needed with the right logistic support, the right artillery support, and try and mitigate as much risk as possible by applying his force where it needed to be applied in an effective way. And the only exception in the course of the Second World War to that rule of his own was probably Operation Market Garden, when he took a risk, and we all know the story, went a bridge too far with 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. But rolling beyond the Second World War, Montgomery's influence continued. And although we talk a lot now about manoeuvre, and we draw on the German experiences of manoeuvre in 1939, 1940, the hallmark of the British Army from 1945 really until the mid-1980s was the application of force. The British Army's warfighting doctrine was called the application of force. And whose picture was on the front of the handbook? It was General Montgomery, Field Marshal Montgomery. His influence really rather stayed there. And again, it's something we say in the book. It was only in the last decade of the Cold War, particularly General Sir Nigel Bagnall, as commander of 1st British Corps and then a commander of NATO's Northern Army Group, actually realized that there had to be an alternative to just facing the Warsaw Pact steamroller as best we could, to try and reignite the thought of understanding warfare at the operational level, reintroducing manoeuvre and the use of reserves onto the battlefield, allowing a certain degree of penetration, counter-penetrating, counter-attacking, counter-striking, bringing an offensive spirit back into the army. And it's that has suffused the army over the last 20, 25 years, because he took his experiences in the British Army of the Rhine and in Northern Army Group on major exercises. When he became Chief of General Staff, he insisted this was actually laid down in a doctrine pamphlet called British Military Doctrine. He insisted that at the Staff College, the Higher Command and Staff course was put in place to train the next 25 or 30 up-and-coming senior commanders, that this operational level of thinking was as important as strategy and tactics. And that has now trickled down through the army, so everybody understands the interplay between the strategic, the operational, and the tactical, and where manoeuvre thought, outmaneuver thought comes in, linked to, and when it's appropriate, attritional methods and the application of force. So in a sense, doctrinally, we've got it all at the present moment. Now, come back to Ukraine. In the first 6 months of this year, the Western countries eventually supplied tanks, self-propelled artillery, armored infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine to give it a sort of maneuver capability that it could absolutely rout and get behind the Russian army in the same way as in September last year in Kharkiv, the Russians turned and ran. What we overlooked was during that period of time, the Russians decided to dig in very determined defensive positions, lots of wire, lots of mines. So the Ukrainians this summer have had a maneuver force which actually became meaningless against a very well prepared set of defenses. So the Ukrainians have now had to fight a very attritional battle to try and break into the enemy's defensive positions with the hope that they might be able to break through and use their maneuver forces to break out and actually achieve the successful result we've all hoped for. This is now late September 2023. I don't think it's going to happen this year, sadly. So the major point I'm making is understanding maneuver is really important, but understanding the use of force in an attritional way is important, and blend them together in your overall operational layout.
It's amazing that in modern warfare today, with all the amazing weaponry that's available, things as World War One-esque as wire and trenches can cause trouble for the Ukrainians.
Of course, you're absolutely right. But overlay on that modern technology. 10 years ago, we wouldn't talk about drones. We wouldn't talk about the type of sophisticated communications that we take for granted now. But the old-fashioned, if you like, World War One trench warfare is being conducted in a context of multitudes of drones, seeing virtually everything that is going on, being able to deliver ordnance on small groups of soldiers who are trying to get through a minefield or whatever, all linked with modern communications. So this is where the old-fashioned and the newfangled come together to make today's modern warfare. And the great sadness for Chancellors of the Exchequer and Defence Secretaries is just because you've got something new doesn't mean to say you can get rid of something old. The golf bag has to get bigger with a smart new driver, as well as your hardy number 4 iron, which you might have thought you wouldn't need anymore. But actually, there are times when you do.
Great stuff. Well, I'm glad you got a golfing metaphor in there. And so I just wanted to, we've mentioned Ireland a few times, but not really in any great detail. And listeners to the podcast are aware of Ireland in the 20th century. And I know, General, you served in Northern Ireland. I was reading up before this that you were actually involved in some business at the business end of the Troubles in the wake of Bloody Sunday. And I just wondered how your experience in Ireland, because of course we'll get onto Ireland in just after the First World War, but I wondered how your experience in Northern Ireland impacted not just your military career, but your life itself, because, I think you served there a number of times.
Yes, you're right. And Rob did during his military career. I mean, for example, in the 1970s, 1977 was the only year I didn't serve in the province. And go back to my first tour in Ardoyne in Belfast in 1971. The violence at the time was extreme. In my battalion during a 4-month tour, 5 soldiers killed, 41 seriously injured. I mean, that is a serious business. And frankly, if I wasn't shot at today, I knew I'd be shot at tomorrow. And at the time, it seemed that with that level of violence, how on earth was there going to be a hope for the future? It seemed to be an intractable problem. The irony is I joined the army in 1969. By 2007, 38 years later, midway through my time as Chief of the General Staff, Operation Banner came to an end. 38 years of an operation in Northern Ireland. If there's one lesson for governments there, it's the need to have strategic patience, to understand what it is you're trying to do, and make sure with your governmental policies and your security policies that you can lay down a framework which ultimately gets you to where you need to be. Now, the strategic issues on the island of Ireland have not been settled. We've still got the double minority of the majority on the island of Ireland being nationalist and Roman Catholic, and the minority on the island of Ireland being loyalist and Protestant. But of course, within Northern Ireland, it's the other way around. You've still got a majority that are loyalist and Protestant, and the minority being nationalist and Catholic. So Ireland still is rather condemned to the double minority problem. Although I think we can actually argue that this is changing. It's influenced largely by the economies of both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And that's changed quite a lot over the last 50 years, how the balance of advantage has swung. But you can't get away from the fact that since the Good Friday Agreement, the quality of life in Northern Ireland is much better. The IRA has put its weapons away by and large, and has gone through a political process as opposed to a warfighting process. So life is better for the people of Northern Ireland, but the underlying issues have not been resolved. And frankly, it's quite difficult to see how they will be resolved. Dare I say it? No, I don't dare say it, really. What I was going to say is the fear of the loyalists in Northern Ireland is that they will cease being the majority and that it will become a united Ireland. And of course, that's what we're seeing politically at the present moment. The Stormont government is not sitting because the party with the largest number of seats at Stormont is now Sinn Féin and is not the Unionists. And that's one of the reasons why there is no devolved government in Northern Ireland at the present moment. Is this a sign of the times? Is this a sign of the direction of travel ultimately towards a united Ireland? Many people would like that to be so. Many people on the Unionist and Loyalist side would not.
One of the great challenges we had when writing the book, I mean, I think the chapter we wrote on Ireland was probably the most difficult, but it was the point that the communities in Ireland from 1914 onward, the point at which Asquith's government refused to come good on home rule, and that was, in our view, a very serious mistake, was the fact that increasingly common ground available to people of goodwill and to the majority of individuals, whether Catholic, Protestant, Loyalist, or Unionist, are diminished dramatically. And we saw that through the Troubles in Northern Ireland as well. And one of the great strategic aims throughout Britain's involvement through the Troubles was, of course, to ensure that common ground could be expanded again to the point at which political unanimity could be achieved. And that was achieved with the Good Friday Agreement. The real challenge now, I think, is that on every side of that particular political divide, need to make the common ground as wide as possible so that everyone can inhabit it and not feel forced to take measures that are at the extreme end of the political dimension. And that's always the biggest challenge for a democracy, of course.
Yeah, that's really interesting because the chapter on Ireland's fascinating. And you mention Asquith's not pushing through the Home Rule Bill. Had that happened, we would be looking at a very different 20th century for Ireland then.
Almost certainly. And the Anglo-Irish War that followed from 2016 to 21 and the terrible civil war that occurred from 1922 onwards and set nationalist Irish against nationalist Irish and caused enormous bloodshed and reverberates down to this day, could have been avoided. And it's a perennial point about political decision-making, isn't it? If you make courageous political decisions early on, you're often left without having to pay the cost of delay. And that was certainly, in our view, the problem with Asquith. Deciding not to prosecute Home Rule until the end of the war with Germany was a political cop-out, essentially, to placate the Unionist members of the army who might otherwise have caused problems with the threat of Home Rule.
And of course, this comes back and just once again illustrates the wider problem, the wider issue that we've been trying to point up in the book. If you don't take decisions in a timely fashion, it's somewhere like Ireland. If you don't take decisions more widely about what kind of army do you want to have in the future for what purpose, then you make the mistakes that were made in the 1930s, which came to fruition disastrously in the Battle of France, the fall of France in May 1940, June 1940, and that's where we are today. And one has to put the facts, put the points of view in front of decision makers to say, well, look, you can argue that history is bunk, but actually there are lessons that we could learn from history by looking back and ask ourselves the question, are we doomed to allow history to repeat itself? I would hope very much that the cautionary tale, that is victory to defeat the British Army 1918 to 1940, can have the beneficial effect of saying, yes, actually, only spending between 2 and 2.5% of our GDP on defence, and certainly not enough on the army, actually means that we are weakening ourselves by design quite unnecessarily. And we need to think again and do differently. Because just like the 1930s, there is an aggressor in Europe who's not just a threat, but he's already demonstrated over the last 18 months that he's willing to invade a sovereign country and incur tens, if not hundreds of thousands of fatalities. Is this a wake-up call, or is it just something else we read about in the newspapers and watch on telly? Actually, it affects us all.
Exactly.
Well, I think it'd be difficult to end it in any other way, General. Thank you very much. Rob, thank you.
Thank you, Ollie.
Thank you very much, Ollie. All the best.
Thanks so much for listening. As I mentioned at the start, plenty of great content to come, as well as former head of US forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, General Petraeus, and Lord Roberts this Saturday. Until then, thank you and good night.